Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis.
Yeah, glad to be here.
We always get into some fascinating stuff on this show.
For sure.
Today we're going to be talking about,
Creativity and self-destruction.
yeah, the age-old question,
Yeah.
right?
Are they connected?
Like, do you have to suffer to create great art?
Yeah, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Michael Largo's book, Genius and Heroin, for this one.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. He really gets into the nitty-gritty.
Absolutely. He profiles over 500 artists, writers, musicians, you name it.
And it's not just like a surface-level look either.
Oh, no, he really digs deep into their lives.
Like their struggles, their addictions, their triumphs, the whole nine yards.
Trying to see if there's a pattern, a connection between their genius and their self-destructive tendencies.
Okay, so before we get too serious here,
Okay.
I got to share this anecdote from the book.
All right, I'm all ears.
So picture this. You're the marketing team at Guinness.
Okay, the beer.
Yeah, and you want a catchy new slogan.
Sure makes sense.
So who do you call?
I don't know who's a good ad guy back then.
Well, they call Brendan Behan.
Brendan Behan, the playwright.
Yeah, brilliant but notoriously hard-drinking Irish playwright.
Oh, boy.
So what slogan does he come up with?
Let me guess. Guinness will get you smashed.
Pretty close.
Yeah.
He said Guinness makes you drunk.
Oh, man, so blunt.
Right. Hilarious, but not exactly what Guinness was looking for.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it kind of gets at the heart of what we're talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah, that fine line between genius and self-destruction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Largo's book looks at tons of artists like Behan.
Yeah, and he tries to answer that question, did they create because of their demons or despite them?
Right. And what's interesting is that he doesn't shy away from challenging that whole tortured artist stereotype.
Yeah, in fact, his research shows that for the vast majority of the artists he studied, like 80% alcohol and drug abuse were actually detrimental to their creative output.
Really? 80%?
Yep, especially in their later years.
So it's not like substance abuse is some magic ingredient for creativity.
Not necessarily. There are always exceptions, of course.
Right, but for most of them, it was more like a hindrance.
Yeah, it's like their talent got overshadowed by their addiction.
We see that with some big names, too.
Oh, yeah, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
The Kubla Khan guy.
That's the one. His opium addiction got so bad that it really messed with his ability to finish projects.
And his later work just wasn't as good.
Right, lacked that spark.
Another example is Sinclair Lewis.
The Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah, his early work was so sharp and insightful.
But then he started struggling with alcoholism.
And his writing suffered.
It lost its edge.
So it's like there's this initial burst, maybe from the lowered inhibitions,
Right, you're looser, you take more risks.
but in the long run, it just burns you out.
Exactly.
Now, Largo did find that a small percentage of artists actually produced their best work while using substances.
Less than 10%.
But still, those cases are fascinating.
They are, because they make you question everything.
Like one example is Antonin Artaud.
Oh, yeah, the French playwright. Very avant-garde.
He was addicted to opium for a long time.
But some of his most famous works were created when he was actually using less opium.
Really?
Yeah, he was working with a psychiatrist who encouraged him to use art as therapy.
Interesting. So maybe structure and support were actually more helpful for him than just indulging in his addiction.
It's possible.
Makes you wonder what could have been if more artists had that kind of support.
Definitely food for thought.
And then there's Neil Cassidy.
The inspiration for Dean Moriarty and On the Road.
Yeah, Largo suggests that he might have had prison psychosis or Ganser syndrome.
That's where people mimic the behaviors of mental patients.
Right. So was his wild personality authentic or a manifestation of this condition?
It's hard to say.
Blurs the lines even further, right?
Sure.
But we can't forget the tragic side of all of this.
Absolutely.
So many artists paid a heavy price for their creativity.
Their self-destructive habits ultimately leading to their demise.
Like Charlie Parker, the legendary jazz saxophonist.
Died at 34 from heroin addiction.
It's heartbreaking to think about all the music we lost.
Imagine what he could have accomplished if he'd lived longer.
It's a common theme, unfortunately.
Yeah, like a flame that burns too bright.
John Berryman is another example.
The poet?
Yeah.
Yeah, he struggled with alcoholism for years.
And tragically took his own life at 57.
His work is still powerful today.
But it's hard to separate it from the tragedy of his end.
It makes you wonder, does knowing the artist's fate change how we interpret their art?
It's a question that lingers for sure.
Especially with someone like Sylvia Plath.
Her quote, "The blood jet is poetry. There is no stopping it," is both haunting and illuminating.
It speaks to the intensity of her creative process,
But it also foreshadows her suicide.
which has become almost inseparable from her legacy.
Right. Would her work be as impactful if she had lived a normal life?
It's a chilling thought.
Plath's case really highlights the complex interplay between genius and mental illness.
Were these artists just more sensitive, more prone to addiction?
Or did the pressures of their creative pursuits make things worse?
It's a question without easy answers.
And we can't ignore the role of societal attitudes.
How addiction and mental illness were viewed back then.
Like Oscar Wilde.
His brilliance was undeniable.
But his homosexuality was a scandal in Victorian society,
He was imprisoned for it.
and it overshadowed his artistic achievements. It makes you wonder how many other brilliant minds have been silenced or overlooked.
Because they didn't fit the mold.
Vincent van Gogh is another example.
His unique vision was dismissed as madness.
He only gained recognition after his death.
Tragic.
It's a reminder that creativity often flourishes on the fringes.
Outside the boundaries of what's considered normal.
And sometimes, society takes a long time to catch up.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've set the stage with some pretty heavy examples.
We have.
Now let's dive into some specific cases.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Where should we start?
Well, let's look at some artists whose work seemed to suffer the most because of their addictions.
Okay, lead the way.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so let's talk about Charles Bukowski.
Oh yeah, Bukowski.
You know him for his gritty writing.
Super raw and honest.
Exactly, and he was praised for his originality, capturing that underbelly of American life.
Definitely. But he was a heavy drinker.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And Largo actually argues in Genius and Heroin that while Bukowski's early work had this raw energy and authenticity, the constant alcohol abuse ultimately led to a decline in the quality of his writing.
Makes sense. I mean, you can only burn the candle at both ends for so long, right?
Right. It's like he traded short-term gain for long-term loss.
And we see this play out with another American literary giant, F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Oh, Fitzgerald. The Great Gatsby guy.
Yeah, his writing is so beautiful and evocative.
It is. But even Fitzgerald, with all his talent, wasn't immune to the effects of alcoholism.
Yeah, his later work just didn't have the same impact.
It's like you can see the potential there, but it's unfulfilled.
Like a star fading out.
Exactly. And Largo suggests that it's not just about willpower or discipline. It's like the substance abuse actually damages the cognitive processes necessary for creativity.
I never thought about it that way.
Yeah. It's not just about inspiration anymore. It's about the ability to think clearly, to connect ideas, to create.
And that damage can manifest in different ways depending on the substance, right?
Right. Largo observed that artists struggling with alcohol addiction tended to produce work that was different in character from those addicted to heroin or other opiates.
So different substances, different effects on the creative process.
Yeah, he even found a correlation between the style of art produced and the manner of the artist's death.
Whoa, hold on. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a little morbid, but he compares someone like Hemingway, who ended his life with a shotgun blast,
Okay.
versus someone like Elvis Presley, whose death was linked to prescription drug abuse.
I guess there is a difference there.
Right. There's a certain violent finality to Hemingway's end that's almost mirrored in his writing.
Yeah, his themes of masculinity and struggle.
Exactly. Whereas Presley's demise was more of a gradual decline, which you could argue is reflected in his later music.
So Largo's saying these correlations aren't just coincidences.
Right. They point to a deeper connection between the artist's inner life, their creative expression, and their ultimate fate.
Wow. It's like we can't separate the art from the artist.
Exactly. They're intertwined, for better or for worse.
It's a lot to think about, but it also makes this whole exploration even more fascinating.
It does. It's like we're trying to decode a secret language. Understand how these artists translated their inner turmoil into art.
Art that still moves and inspires us today.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that we're not condoning or romanticizing these self-destructive behaviors.
Right, we're just trying to understand them.
To see them as part of a larger human story.
Okay, so we've talked about artists whose work suffered because of addiction.
Right.
But what about those who created their best work while under the influence?
Yeah, let's explore that side of the equation.
Because that's what fuels that whole tortured artist myth, right?
It does. But as Largo shows us, it's more complicated than that.
Well, one name that comes to mind is Thomas de Quincey.
Oh, yeah. The Confessions of an English Opium Eater Guy.
Exactly. He was very open about how opium influenced his writing.
He saw it as a way to expand his consciousness.
To access hidden realms of imagination.
And his writing is incredibly vivid.
Full of dreamlike imagery.
You can definitely see the influence of opium there.
But of course, there's a dark side to the story, too.
Oh, yeah. He struggled with addiction for years.
And it took a toll on his health and relationships.
It's a classic example of how even when substance use seems to enhance creativity, there's often a personal cost.
A heavy price to pay.
For sure.
It reminds us that creativity is complex,
Influenced by so many factors.
not just substances.
Right. And another example of that is Edgar Allan Poe.
Ah, Poe, the master of the macabre.
He was definitely haunted by his own demons.
And his struggles with alcohol and opium are well documented.
His stories have this sense of dread, this psychological torment that clearly comes from his own experiences.
It's captivating but unsettling at the same time.
But even when he was writing under the influence, he was still a brilliant craftsman.
So it wasn't just like he was spilling his subconscious onto the page.
No, he was very deliberate, very artistic in his use of language.
So even in those cases where substance use seemed to fuel creativity, there was still conscious effort, a mastery of craft involved.
Absolutely. We can't reduce these artists to their addictions.
Their genius was much more than that.
Right. And it brings us back to that question, why are we so fascinated by the tortured artist?
It's a question that's been around forever.
Is it because we romanticize suffering?
Do we believe that great art has to come from pain?
Or are we just drawn to extremes?
To people who live outside the norm?
I think it's a combination of factors.
Yeah, we admire those who push boundaries, who defy expectations.
And when that manifests in both creative brilliance and self-destructive behavior, it's a captivating story.
Even if it's a tragic one.
Exactly. It's like we're looking for a secret formula.
Some hidden truth about what it means to be human.
But the truth is there are no easy answers.
And it's dangerous to romanticize self-destruction.
Absolutely. Creativity doesn't require it.
In fact, true creative expression often comes when we're taking care of ourselves.
Physically and mentally.
It's about finding that balance.
Between pushing boundaries and nurturing our well-being.
Creating a culture where artists feel supported.
Where they can pursue their passions without sacrificing their mental health.
Okay, so we've looked at both sides of the coin.
Artists whose work suffered and those who seem to thrive while using substances.
It's clear that the link between creativity and self-destruction is complicated.
Multifaceted.
But Largo doesn't just present case studies.
No, he offers a broader analysis.
What can we learn from all of this?
How can we move forward in a way that honors both creativity and mental well-being?
I'm ready to hear his conclusions.
Let's dive into that in our final segment.
All right, how's good? Let's do it. Welcome back, everyone. So we've been talking about this connection between creativity and self-destruction.
Yeah, looking at all these brilliant but often troubled artists.
Trying to make sense of it all.
It's a puzzle, for sure.
So after all his research, what conclusions does Michael Largo come to in Genius and Heroin?
Well, one of the most interesting things he says is that our obsession with creativity is kind of like a substitute for our fading belief in an afterlife.
That's deep.
He says, and I'm paraphrasing here, our current obsession with creativity is the result of our continued striving for immortality in an era when most people no longer believe in an afterlife.
So it's like we're trying to find meaning and purpose in something that will outlast us.
Exactly. And art is one way to do that.
It's like we elevate artists to this special status.
Like they have access to something we don't.
And their work becomes this sacred thing.
That transcends the ordinary.
Which ties back into that whole tortured artist idea.
Right. We romanticize their suffering.
Like it's a necessary part of the creative process.
Like you have to pay a price for genius.
But does understanding this fascination with the dark side of creativity change how we view the art itself?
That's the big question, isn't it?
I mean, on one hand, knowing the artist's struggles can add a whole new layer to their work.
Right. You see it in a different light.
Like you can feel their pain, their search for meaning.
But we have to be careful not to reduce the art to just a product of their suffering. The art should be able to stand on its own.
Exactly. Judge for its own merits.
Regardless of the artist's life.
So it's about finding that balance.
Appreciating the art while acknowledging the human story behind it.
We don't have to shy away from the darkness.
But we shouldn't romanticize it either.
So where do we go from here?
We've explored this link between creativity and self-destruction.
What have we learned?
What can we take away from all of this?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that we need to move beyond that tortured artist narrative.
Creativity doesn't have to equal suffering.
It shouldn't.
True creativity often flourishes when we're taking care of ourselves.
When we're healthy and balanced.
It's about finding that sweet spot.
Between pushing boundaries and nurturing our well-being.
In creating a culture where artists feel supported.
Where they can be creative without sacrificing their mental health. So it's a call to action for all of us.
To be mindful of our own mental health.
To reach out for help when we need it.
And to create a world that celebrates creativity.
Without the expectation of suffering.
Well said.
So that's it for this episode of the Mad Genius Thesis.
We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into Genius and Heroin.
And we encourage you to keep the conversation going.
Share your thoughts on social media.
And most importantly, take care of yourselves.
Until next time, stay curious and keep creating.